Local productions on QTV are made possible with support from viewers like you. Thank you.
Hello everyone, I'm Junia, and this is Uncommon Sense. Thank you for joining us today. My guest today is Dr. John Pafford. John is a semi-retired professor of history and philosophy at Northwood University and author of the novel The Forgotten Conservative: Rediscovering Grover Cleveland. John earned his BA in history from Hobart College in Geneva, New York. He received his master's in history from Temple University and his PhD in history from the International College in California, where he studied under philosopher Russell Kirk. He came to Northwood University in 1976. So welcome, John.
Thank you very much.
When you think of history, when you decided to get into history, what intrigued you?
First of all, there is the formal answer, and then there's a very personal answer. The formal answer would be to quote from the philosopher George Santayana to the effect that those who will not learn from history are condemned to repeat it.
Yeah.
And so history is very significant. The problem so often is that we have people living at a given point in time who don't know the past, and so they can make the same mistakes over and over again. So I believe that very strongly. The personal aspect of it is, though, that history has been enjoyable for me, just plain fun, as far back as I can remember.
Even in high school?
Oh yes, even before.
Now you went to a prep school in Florida.
Yes, I did. Naval prep school.
I see. And how come you went there?
I wanted to go to Florida, and I liked the idea of the adventure of going to a naval school.
Oh, interesting, interesting. When I studied history, it was all about wars and dates. Is that how you first started learning history?
Yes, I can remember World War II, and so there is at first that idea of studying the major events. And of course, growing up during World War II, it was something of great significance for us. Then gradually studying deeper, learning why did a war break out, what caused it, and what was the aftermath of the war. Did things get better or did things get worse? So gradually there was a deepening appreciation of history.
And as you teach history now and before you semi-retired, what would you emphasize?
Well, what I've mentioned so far, that if you don't know what happened in the past, you don't really understand what is happening today, and you won't be able to prepare for the future. And also, too, it's just plain fun as well.
One of the things that interests me is cultural history. And the Metropolitan Museum in New York ran an exhibit in which they showed paintings and then also costumes, dresses from the period, and sometimes the dresses were actually in the paintings, and you could see, of course you knew how the paintings sort of changed in fashion, but to see the actual outfit was really it added a dimension, was very pleasurable to me.
I think the visual does add a whole dimension. This is something my wife will appreciate very much, to hear me say. Her field is interior design. And yes, I agree that the visual aspect does really add a whole new dimension.
When you teach history, how do you engage the students? Make them want to learn, besides having to get the credit for the course.
Right. Get them to think about what is the significance of what happened, and also to think along the lines of, was there an alternative way that things could have worked out? Could things have been done better? Can we learn that? And to think in terms of what it means on a deeper level, probe, and think. And don't just deal with what happened. What happened, of course, is significant, but why? Why did it happen? Is there a good reason?
And how would you find that out? Why did it happen?
You can study the reality of the records. Now, there is always the question that people like to raise as to whether history is just what somebody says it is. But
Yes.
we can know the facts of history. We can get into a lot of debate as to what those facts mean. So, for example, we can easily go back to the 1930s and study the Great Depression, study
Yes.
what the Roosevelt administration did, study what came out of those policies, and we know the facts, we know the realities. Now, what is the significance? Then we are widely apart because obviously we have people who regard the New Deal as the worst thing that happened in American history, others who think it's the greatest thing that happened in American history. So we do have great disputes over the meaning and what is the significance of this. But we really can understand what did happen.
Do you know, one of the things I've asked myself personally in life is, if I make a decision, what have I missed in my own life? What have I missed separate from what I thought I was deciding on? In other words,
Right.
the unintended consequences. And I just wonder if people, it's hard to answer this kind of a question, but people in positions of authority, if they really think, I think the Europeans thought, longer term. I don't see any of our discussions of issues of the day that contain long-range, in-depth, thorough. Here, if we do this, we think da 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 da. If we do that, it's a little bit, but not a lot. So when we're in mass communications, when we're sort of up to date, as it were, minutely on things, it's harder to step back from the details, for me sometimes, and to say, okay, what's significant about this, 3 decades from now?
Right. And for people who are running for political life, there's always the problem of the next election. And so I think we have a lot of people in politics who deep down inside may understand the implications of what their policies are, but they're thinking in terms of a short-term advantage. What's going to happen at the next election? What will happen to me then? What will happen to my party then? And what is going to transpire in 5 years, 10 years, 20 years won't affect me, and so
Yeah.
I won't get into it. We can always get into talking about examples of politicians, but we have had people in public life in this country who I believe have made that mistake of not basing their policies in office on what they know to be right, on what they understand to be correct, but instead have thought in terms of what will work now, what will get us by this immediate problem. And that can be the difficulty when you have frequent elections. Now, of course, there's also the reality that without elections, you can have things be even worse, too. There's that famous statement by Churchill that democracy is the worst system of government one can imagine until you think of the alternatives.
Yes, the others. What drew you to Grover Cleveland as a subject to write a biography about?
That's interesting because I grew up on Cape Cod, about 10 miles from where Grover Cleveland had his summer home. I appreciated him in general, but as a young boy and as a young man, I found people and places farther away much more interesting, much more romantic, much more exciting. And so I really didn't get into studying Cleveland in any degree of depth until just just a few years ago, really. I appreciated him in general as a man who had done a good job as president, but he just didn't seem terribly interesting. So there are a couple of books that I had read that got me thinking more deeply about him. One was a short book on the Depression of 1893 by Larry Reed, who used to be
Yeah.
here in Midland. And the other one was A Patriot's History by Larry Schweikert, and he got into a little more depth on Cleveland and had me thinking there's something to this man that I haven't appreciated. There's a depth here. And so the more I studied him, the more I appreciated him as a man of integrity, honor,
Yeah.
as a man who believed in limited government, low taxation, sound money, and he also was a believer in a sound foreign policy. He would stand up for American interests, but he was not an interventionist by nature. So I found him really a very admirable person, again, in terms of personal integrity, limited government, low taxation, low regulation, general market economy. He was a believer in strong action in government, but in a limited number of areas.
You mentioned honor. Could you explain what you mean by that?
Yes, Cleveland was definitely a man who had a Christian foundation for his principles. There was one sex scandal in Cleveland's earlier years, which we could get into later if we want to probe that. It's possible that he had fathered an illegitimate child. It's not clear. He was unmarried at the time, a younger man. But during his public life and during his private life from thereafter, there's not a breath of scandal that even his enemies could find. And in the 19th century, if there was any hint of scandal, it would be brought up by your political opponents. But there was nothing that these people could use, so he very definitely had that high degree of honor and integrity, of honesty. He did not have anything in the way of public scandals. He did not have his hand in the cookie jar, so to speak.
Yeah.
And so there is that constant record that not even his enemies could spoil. And he knew government very well. He was a strong-willed man, very determined, very tough. And he knew what he believed, he knew what he wanted to do, and he would do what was right regardless of the cost. He wouldn't worry about the next election. If he were absolutely convinced that this is something which has to be done for the good of the country, then he would take that stand and lead in that direction. And again, he would not worry about the next election. And naturally, he wanted to win. I don't mean he's oblivious to it,
Right.
but doing what was right would always come ahead of doing what was expedient. When you look into his record, you see that with clarity. With a lot of other figures in American history, you don't see that clear determination to do the right thing rather than the expedient thing.
Yes, he took responsibility too.
Right.
You worked with Russell Kirk earlier on.
Yes.
What was it like to study with him?
Thrilling. He could keep me silent for an extended period of time. Normally I'm happiest when I'm communicating, when my mouth is working. But I could sit and listen to Russell Kirk, literally, by the hour. I'd been a fan of his based on reading his books when I was living in California. Then when we moved to Midland, Michigan in 1976, when I went to teach at Northwood, I had checked the map before and found how close Mecosta was to Midland and made a point of getting in touch with him, got to know him, and then studied for my doctorate under him. And I found him absolutely fascinating.
Would you say a word about him for people who may not be familiar with him?
Yes, an interesting explanation of how things change in a country has been brought about by those who would say that changes take place in a civilization first on the level of ideas, then there are those who popularize the ideas, then there are those who will put the ideas into implementation in public policy. Russell Kirk was a man of ideas, paramountly a man of ideas. Lee Edwards wrote an interesting book on this point, and he set forth as a good example of how this country started moving in a conservative direction during the post-World War II years, that Russell Kirk, as the man of ideas, set the stage. Then he looked to William F. Buckley as a man who did a good job popularizing the idea, and then Ronald Reagan as a man who put the ideas into practice. But Russell Kirk wrote extensively on the foundations of Western civilization. He wrote about what was wrong with the way things had gone during the 1930s and 1940s, and then set forth how to get back onto the right course in terms of our overall civilizational direction. He was not essentially a politician. He was a man of ideas. He understood that about himself. He wasn't going to be a popularizer. He wasn't going to get on television and have a mass audience. He didn't have that charisma, but he was fascinating to listen to if you would focus on his ideas. And it was very interesting to go to Mecosta to meet with him, because there at the Kirk Center in Mecosta would be people coming from all around the world. Now you could find people in central Michigan who had never heard of him, but there were people coming from around the world to study under him, to meet him, from Europe, from Asia, from Africa. It's just a fascinating experience.
I didn't know that. What were some of his principal ideas that impressed you?
Yeah, well, first of all, there is the Christian foundation of Western civilization. He was clear on that. And then he was also very clear that what we have got to have, if we are going to have a sound civilization, is a firm belief, not only in those principles, but in what they represent in terms of integrity, what they represent in terms of depth of study. So he was clear on things like limited government. He did believe in that. And he would have limited government as an outgrowth of his ideas. And he did believe that the United States had to represent strength, that it represented essentially what is good. And so clearly, coming out of Kirk was the whole idea of our civilization needing to be revived. And we need to learn of it, to study it, and to be inspired by it, and not just to drift along.
Revival, that's interesting. How did he see that happening, or what were the necessary steps?
Then we go to the next stage. He saw his responsibility to appeal to people who are then going to be influencing others in the academic world. He became a Roman Catholic. He grew up really in a general agnostic setting. He went through this as a young man with no appreciation really for religion. But as he studied our civilization more and more, he saw that without a spiritual foundation, the civilization will not stand on anything. There's nothing under it. And so he became a Roman Catholic, essentially looking to a church which was universal and back at the time when he joined, traditional. And so he started with that as a foundational belief. Then getting into the principles of limited government, of law and order, justice, and freedom. He set forth those three principles with great clarity. Order must come first in any civilization. If you have disorder, if there is chaos, nothing is going to function. Once you have order, out of order can then grow justice. You have respect for property, for example. Once you have order and justice, then freedom can come forth. But he was convinced that freedom cannot exist unless order and justice precede it. So that made Russell Kirk sharply different from libertarians, who instead would argue that freedom comes first and then order and justice would spring forth from them.
Interesting. The question I get, how would order take place if there was disorder to begin with?
You have to have a strong government which will first of all impose law and order so that business can function, so that transportation can work, so that people can get to jobs, so they can safely do their work. That comes first. Now, that's not the end of a civilization, but unless you have order, the other two cannot transpire.
And what would be an example of that?
I would give South Korea as a very good example. After World War II, South Korea became independent from the Japanese Empire. South Korea, first of all, did have a government which imposed order, and then there was justice which came forth once the order took place. And under order and justice, and businesses could function well, people could trust in the exchange of goods, and then finally freedom has been established. Freedom has emerged in South Korea. There are free elections there.
Interesting. I haven't just sort of read about that in our foreign, in the discussions running up to the Syria discussion, which we will not discuss. This is not about current events of this program. But has that influenced your life and the kind of decisions you've made?
Yes, although obviously I'm not operating on the macro level of being responsible for a whole country, but it certainly does give me a sense of perspective and to look beyond what's transpiring right now. Of course, there are things we have to do right now. I have to keep gas in my car, for example, have to have food on the table. But beyond that, there are things which are going to affect future generations. No generation is going to exist forever. Those of us alive today, after all, do owe a great deal to those who went before us. We didn't create this free society. We didn't create the prospering economy. but we inherited it. And then we in turn are going to pass something on to those who will come after us. So each generation does not exist in isolation. It has a responsibility to those who will come after it, and it has a sense of obligation to those who came before it.
Well, what do you think, or what would you pass on as a generation who's lived and handing it over to the next generation?
I think what we've got to have, first of all, is a good, solid spiritual foundation so that we know what is right, we know what is wrong. Then we can have our everyday lives emerging from that foundation. If you have people who don't have any set of values beyond what's in it for themselves, then you're going to have people stealing, lying, cheating. There will be a stoppage up to a certain point of lying, stealing, and cheating by government. So government does impose order. That does restrain the negative aspects of people. But you don't want a society in which order is only going to be preserved by being imposed by an outside force. The ideal is that you have an orderly society because you have principled people, people who will do the right thing because it is the right thing, not because they have to do it. So the less we have of that, people doing the right thing because it's the right thing, the more we have to have of order imposed. We can look around our society and see, for example, if you have a gas station in which you have to prepay, then you obviously know they've dealt with the problem of people pumping gas and then just driving off. These are people who are not controlled by any sense of an internal compass. And so you have to have an outside authority imposed. But that's not ideal. We don't want just to live with people looking over our shoulders, with people controlling us. We're constantly worried about what's going to happen to us. There has to be that inner compass. That has to come first. And then once you have that, then you can have the sense of working to produce, be productive in life. Leave behind the world a little better than you found it.
I've always thought for myself that, excuse me, that either you have self-control, internal controls, or you're going to have the government do it and impose it on you. So it's much better to have self-control, or for individuals in the society to have self-control. So, and your family, tell me about your family. What was it like from their political point of view? Or did you rebel? Did you agree? What kind of a family was it living up in Cape Cod?
Yes and yes. I did rebel and I did end up agreeing. I was a typical kid who was raised with the concept that parents know everything, can handle everything. Then I went through a period of rebellion, wanting to be different. My father was not college educated. He had to go to work at a very early age, had served in the British Army in World War I in Gallipoli and then in the Sinai Desert in Palestine, then was in the U.S. Army, then went into business, was very successful. And I decided for a period of time as a teenager that it would be much more exciting, glamorous, romantic, and individualistic to be a socialist. The problem was, the more I studied socialism, I found I could not agree with it. So I was brought up with clear teachings. I did try to rebel against them, but ended up agreeing. My father was a Republican. He was poor during the Depression, but never was drawn to FDR, and worked through and, as I said, became very, very successful. And so we did have talks on politics, and I did appreciate very much the foundation which I was given. He was not one of these modern parents who would decide that you cannot restrict your kid at all. To him, a wise kid was a wise kid, and so his belt would come off and be applied to the proper place. So I had to do what was right. Initially, I was not doing what was right because I believed in it. It was because I would think, what happened the last time I did this? What happened the last time I said this? Oh yes, okay, I don't want to do that. But then comes the inner discipline, the inner control. And so that gives root to the just outer control. You don't want people to go through life only being controlled by outward fears, by outward restraints. They have to be there in a civilization because everybody is not perfect by any means. We have imperfect human beings, but we want to grow to where we have that inner self-control.
And sorry, in your case, it was the strap. Did I hear you correctly?
You did. His belt would come off his pants. Now, I wasn't beaten to a bloody pulp. He wasn't cruel, but it would sting, and I would remember.
So you were a rebellious child. Sometimes.
Oh, well, yes, yes, yes. I was not a perfect little angel.
Oh, I can't believe that.
I know, it's hard to believe.
Thank you, John. So a lot we have learned here. Specifically, self-control is useful. The Russell Kirk approach, first order, then justice, and then freedom applies not only to societies, but applies to life. And it has been a good modus operandi for him. He's devoted himself to teaching, to popularizing history, which is one of the roles that Russell Kirk identified, the idea, the popularizer, and the political. And he's lived a very good life still, with more to come. And I thank you for tuning in, and I hope you will join us next time. Remember, kindness counts. Please go out and do something kind for someone you know and someone you don't know today and henceforward, and we'll see you next time. Thanks an awful lot. And thank you, John.
To contact Junia, send her an email at info@juniadone.com. For more information, program schedules, and news about future guests, go to www.juniadone.com. Thanks for joining us. See you next time for Uncommon Sense with Junia Doan.
Local productions on QTV are made possible with support from viewers like you. Thank you.